Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to come along to this session. It means a lot to you. I know there's lots of busy stuff going on around at IBTM out there at the moment, so thanks for taking the time to come to the Accelerate stage. My name's Al Turner. I've been working with my colleague Adam Parry, and we have been part of the curation of this particular stage. And what I want to do before we introduce the lovely people at EventsAir is just to set into some degree of context what's happening here at Accelerate. So the theme for Accelerate for this year is tech for good. So that's how tech can be good for events, but how tech can be good for the world as well. So that's our general theme. On the first day, we looked at now. So the technology that's available now and how that's influencing the world of events. Then we looked yesterday at near, so the technology that's kind of emerging now, coming over the next sort of year and a half. And today we're having some fun, and we're looking at the future and maybe beyond that. So there's all sorts of sessions this morning and this afternoon that are going to look at just some fun, stargazing and things like that. Every single session is being recorded and available for download. So if you're only here today or you missed some of the sessions or you have work to do go onto YouTube after this show and find those sessions, because hopefully what you'll see is a narrative emerging that brings some of these themes to life. So please do that as you go. In the meantime, thanks so much for coming to this session. I will pass you into the very capable hands of EventsAir. If you wouldn't mind giving him a lovely ripple of warm welcome. It's the least these people deserve.
Well, given that we're... Oh, that's a bit loud. Or I'm a bit loud, one or the other. Oh, there we go. So given that we're on the last day of the event, thank you for taking the time to come and spend it with me. The EventsAir showcase is not misleading, but what we don't want to do is we don't want this to be a sales pitch. So this is not strictly about EventsAir. It's about some of the things that we've built in our technology that other providers are also building into their technology that you can use as event planners going forward. And what I really want to try and focus on today is one of the challenging topics that we're all grappling with coming out of COVID. You know, going into COVID, we all knew what meetings were, we all knew what audiences were, we were in a room like this, and that was pretty much for most of us what we did in our events. There were a number of event planners who had made that leap into some sort of virtual delivery in the years prior, but they were generally very, very large events. They weren't mainstay. And then we went into COVID, and of course we all ended up in this virtual space, and that was solely where we ended up for a period of time. Coming out of COVID and having all of that virtual technology now, and I'm sure you're all aware that during that period there was almost 700 different virtual platforms that evolved. So in a very short space of time, the span of 18 months, 700 new technology providers popped up just in that virtual space. So it's an enormous evolution of technology that ordinarily would have taken us somewhere between 5 and 10 years to have made that jump. And I've quite often commented to people in our space that if I'd been asked in January 2020 if we were ever going to go into that virtual space, the answer would have been no. Categorically no. We were in an in-person world. We've now moved beyond that. And what does that then look like? So the question then is, how do we use technology to deliver a modern day event, and what does that modern day event look like? And there we go. So the question really now starts to evolve is, who is our audience, or who are our audience? We've always moved into this world where we've had in-person. We know in-person, we all want to go back to in-person, we all want to do those types of things. And I think the event planners that I speak to on a weekly basis are all really driving to get back. You know, we've come back to IBTM, we all enjoy being together, but in that world, there's this new era where we've opened a door for a group of people who, for whatever reason, may not have been able to attend events. It might be disability, it might be financial constraints. There's a whole host of reasons as to why they couldn't come to events. And we opened the door for them through COVID. So we've now got this group of people who are now in our audience, who are our remote attendees. And there's this grappling conversation going on of, what do we do with events? Do we support events? Do we not support remote attendance at events? Not supporting events, do we support remote attendance at events? What do we do with them? Or are we all just going to go back into in-person? As a bit of a show of hands in the audience, and if you'd want to, how many of you are still doing virtual? Okay, good. good percentage. That's fantastic to see, because the overwhelming trend is to actually push back the other way and to go back to in-person. And I think my feeling personally on this is we really need to try and buck that trend, to try and be all-inclusive, because some of the things that we're talking about these days is, of course, how we include broader audiences, inclusivity, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, but how do we actually make an event all-inclusive? And we've all talked about this word hybrid. So we're talking about what is hybrid. A remote, in-person audience, is it actually bringing those two audiences together in a simultaneous delivery? Is it actually taking those audiences and actually having some sort of digital content that people can access after the event? What is hybrid? And I think one of the things that I want everybody to take away from today is it doesn't really matter what we call it. I don't think we should call it hybrid anymore. We're really trying to move away from that word. But an event, as we've always called it, should just be an event. How we have people attend those events, that's a very different story. So an event should be opened up to everybody, and we then need to look at how we deliver those options of attendance to our attendees. So, moving into that sort of mindset, it's then about focusing on an all-inclusive blended attendance, and there are many ways that we can do this, and I've spoken about a couple of them just previously, where it might be we're trying to bring all of the attendees together. It might be that in a session like this that we're broadcasting it live. It's already been talked about in the introduction that this will be recorded and it'll be made available going beyond the event, so you'll be able to access it down the track. It depends on your interpretation of what an event is and what hybrid is. But I think at the end of the day, we really should be looking, in my mind, at a simultaneous event that people can duck in and duck out of. That event might start in advance of the actual event time. So it might be that you open the event 2 weeks in advance and maybe there's some content there that people are already engaging in prior to the actual on-site days. I think the on-site days, really we need to start to look at how do we more easily broadcast that content and make that content available using technology to our audience. And then beyond the event, you might consider how do you elongate the event to actually, I suppose, prolong that engagement with your attendees. So we really need to start thinking differently, and that's a really tough thing for event planners. And again, go back to the conversations I've had with many of the customers that we've got where they know how to run in-person events. And overwhelmingly, when you bring technology into the fray, they say, it's really complex, we don't understand it, there's huge cost to it, all of those sorts of factors, and they become barriers to how we're going to manage our events, how we're going to engage with our attendees, and how we're really going to think about events going forward. You may or may not remember, depending on your age in the audience, you may remember this campaign, which of course was this little company back in the 1980s called Apple. And in the 80s and 90s, Apple really grappled with the other tech giants, Microsoft at the time and Cisco and some of the other really big guys. But Apple decided that they were going to think differently, and they decided they were going to stay the course, and there was a few ups and downs and so on. And I think we all know the story of where Apple is now with $1 trillion valuation as one of the top 5 companies in the world. So bringing that into context of the event planning space, it's very, very easy for us to say, hey, we could go back to what we know, but should we? And I think really I'd ask everyone that we really do need to think differently. There might be some challenges, there might be some increases in costs, but we need to start thinking differently. And what we'll then talk about now is how we can look at some of those areas that you can deliver an event, and it doesn't need to be painful, it doesn't need to be costly, but we'll walk through that. So how do our attendees want to participate? Is that up to us to define, or is it up to them? I actually think that attendees should be able to attend in whatever way they feel is convenient to them in an event these days. So again, going back to that whole categorization of attendees, we've got our in-person attendees. They might want to attend in person. We've then also got this group that you may or may not be aware of or might not have put a label on, but in-person remote attendees. And this is an increasing trend where even at this event, you may find, although we're not broadcasting that much content from this event at the time that it's being done, but what you might find is that people actually go to your event, and rather than being in the room, they're sitting in the lobby, or they're sitting in their hotel room, or they're sitting other places, and they're viewing that content on their mobile device, or on their laptop, or something like that, typically their mobile device. And with event planners that we've been speaking to, more and more, because their attendees are busy people, they're multitasking. And so they do want to be in the content, they do want to be in the session, they want to be part of it, they want to view it, but they can't necessarily be in the room. So an in-person remote attendee is a sort of a new attendee blend that we need to give our attendees the ability to be able to take up if they wish to in their flexible working world. And then, of course, remote. And, we actually founded our own user conference recently. Although event planners overwhelmingly have said, yes, we all want to get back to in-person, we had about a 60-40 split where our own event planning attendees actually chose to attend in virtual, largely driven by the fact that they were busy people, they had events on at the time, they couldn't be in multiple places at once, or they had travel challenges or whatever it might be, that just the days didn't correspond, and they chose to attend virtually, but they wanted to be at the event. And because we gave them the option to do so, they could do that. I've also heard recently, and this is a bit of a contentious point, that some of our event planners are taking an upside down approach with the way that they actually charge now for digital events, where we all through the pandemic started thinking about, do we actually charge less for virtual attendance because there isn't the level of engagement as we perceived? A lot of them are actually turning around saying, no, we're going to charge more for digital, because it's a bit like going to a convenience store. The convenience of digital is great, but there has to be a cost for that convenience, and we want to try and drive people to our events. So a lot of event planners are actually saying now, we're turning it around the other way. And if you want to come to the event, that's the rate. If you want to actually have the convenience of being online and doing it in your own time, then there's a higher rate. So that'll be something also to consider. And you need to think about, with all of these different strategies of attendance, how do you charge for them? That's a different question that we won't cover necessarily today. But it's very much about allowing the attendee to choose how do they actually attend the event. So why should we extend them beyond that room? We've talked about the possibilities of increased revenue, which is fantastic. We all want to do that. The conversation has been going on for, well, as long as I've been in the industry, which is just over 2 decades, about how do we drive increases in revenue to attendance at events. One would be potentially thinking differently and saying, well, maybe we do want to charge more for virtual attendees. It's possible. Maybe we create different attendee types, and so there's different virtual attendee types or something like that. There's a whole host of reasons that you might want to do that from a revenue perspective. But the other ones that we all talk about is things like sustainability and inclusivity. So with inclusivity and sustainability, I think we tend to pay quite a bit of lip service to this, but we don't necessarily deliver on that. So I think all of us have had tenders and so on, where they ask you about your rankings of inclusivity and so on. How do we actually deliver on that? And I think if we're not using some sort of technology to allow people that can't be in the room to attend, we may not be taking inclusivity completely seriously. It's also a factor of that whole case of those people that can afford to attend and can't afford to attend, giving them another option that breaks down those barriers and says, well, look, no, you can be part of it. You're not a second-class citizen. You can attend, but, a lot of event planners aren't necessarily open to that because they're shutting that virtual path down. So inclusivity and then sustainability. And sustainability isn't just environmental. And we look at this in a number of ways, which technology can help out in. So sustainability is, of course, there's an environmental facet to it, there's an economic facet to it, and in all of those areas that we talk about in terms of increasing revenue, in terms of reducing carbon footprint, technology plays a big part in that. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying that you should not get people to an event. I am not saying we should diminish the number of people that are coming to events. What we're talking about with sustainability is saying, if we've got 100 people coming to our event and 30 of them are attending virtually, all of a sudden we've got a reduction in our CO2 overall of the attendee base, and we start to look towards the way that our sustainability metrics swing. We're making our events more sustainable. It's going to take some time to get them to zero, but we're making them more sustainable. In some of the slides that we talk about shortly as well, we'll then also look at how some of the use of technology and the way that we deploy technology goes into that sustainability as well. The last point is then reach, and I think this is the thing that a lot of event planners have sort of overlooked coming back from the pandemic. So we're trying to get people back into an event. How do we do that? How do we get technology to help us to do that? Well, again, ultimately, getting people back into an event in person, that goes back to what we used to do. We're marketing, we're using social media, we're using all of those old tools. But Reach is about now saying those areas that we spoke about earlier, how do we maintain those connections? How do we engage with those people? Associations in particular have got a great opportunity because historically where you had generally a regional base of people that might be within your membership, you can now expand out, absolutely globally. You can grow that membership exponentially and you can then get them to attend more events. And it can be a blend of digital and in person, because people are now more open to attending virtual events because that's what we've all become accustomed to. So that reach aspect is really important too. And again, when we look at reach and the blend of events, if you're doing let's say a 60-40 split on your digital to in-person events, again, from an overall standpoint of sustainability in the year, you're going to end up with a metric that's going to be swinging in your favour because you've reduced your footprint over the number of events that you're running. So, talking about all of those factors, how does technology then come into play? And this is something that we've really been working on through the pandemic and coming out the other side. And so when we built virtual platforms through the pandemic, that was fantastic. It did the job at the time. But not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, we want to look at how we can maintain the use of those platforms and how can we make it cost effective. Because the biggest challenge that we've heard is increased AV costs, broadcasting all of your sessions. How do we do that and how do we make it work? So of course, the number one thing is your online portals. And when we talk about online portals, these were traditionally very costly. The challenge of setting them up in an environment, there was duplication. If you set up an in-person event, do you have to then go and set up an online portal at the time that you set up the event, or do you have to, plan it out? All of those challenges that came into play. And I'll talk about how to resolve this in a minute. We're just going to talk about some of the challenges, or some of the technology to start with. The attendee app, this is the glue really to bringing everybody together, and we didn't really ever use these effectively enough, but now broadcasting out on things like the attendee app allows you to do those things that I was talking about earlier on, where you can now sit outside the venue, you can now watch these sessions on a mobile device, and you can do it extremely effectively. Not only can you watch those sessions, you can engage with all of your peers as well, because you've got things like discussion forums, chat forums in those sessions on those devices. You can engage in Q&A, you can engage in polls, and you can do that from anywhere. And similarly with the online portals, you've got the ability to bring all of that data together and have all of that engagement across both audiences. And there's not really any cost to it. If you use the right platforms, you can do it really quickly and reduce your costs. Networking. Now, I know this is another one that event planners have talked about that really is a challenge. We've heard from many event planners that virtual networking didn't really work. People didn't get the same level of engagement. I completely agree. It's not the same as being in the room, talking to somebody face to face, but it is a fantastic second place if you can't be in an event. And it's another piece of inclusivity that if you're going to provide as I term it now, a digital overlay, if you're going to provide that digital piece of an event, you need to get your digital attendees to be able to engage. If they can't reach out to all of the in-person attendees and vice versa, you're not providing an all-inclusive event. Now, these pieces are actually in your apps. We've had them for years. It's not new technology, but we're not really utilizing it fully. So it's one of those things that we really need to use better. Gamification. Now, we've all talked about gamification. How do we then utilize these tools across both audiences? And again, many platforms that you may have encountered, you actually then have to set up duplicated programs. So you've got something happening in the live person world, you've got something happening in the digital world, and then you've got to try and make the two come together. Technology platforms actually bridge that gap because it allows you to now use your tools with your attendee apps and your mobile platforms to bring all of that together into one place. So you're having everybody compete in one place, and you're not having to extend hours, cost, and so on in terms of duplication. And then social walls. This is a really interesting mindset as well. So I don't know how many of you actually these days have social walls at your event, but they were a very popular thing for many years. And prior to COVID, almost all events had them. You'd have your attendees walking around the venue, people are taking photographs, videos, people would be liking them and so on. When we went into COVID, it then moved online, and we've sort of lost our way a little bit there. A lot of people didn't put any of that social media content as richly online as they did in the in-person world. It's now a case of then bringing that back and blending them together. So with a social wall like this, what you've actually got is you've got the ability for the in-person attendees to see it on screens and so on. They can also see it on their mobile devices. And then in the online world, you can actually have all of those online attendees viewing all of that content, putting their own participation up, putting their photographs of their cats or whatever they want on there that they're actually in the middle of experiencing and sharing that with other people. So it actually then starts to bring those two attendee groups together. Right. And then also in terms of content, it's how do we then extend the experience? So in terms of all the content you've captured, many event planners don't use this content effectively. They don't use it to bridge that gap between the audiences. And so using that content to prolong your experience really does help to build the event experience between your attendee groups. So looking at all of that, we've walked through a whole lot of tools. Many of you will have used them, but again, I come back to that comment from earlier on and the age-old question, it's expensive. I don't have the time, I don't have the team, I don't have the resources. How do we do it? Bringing all of this together comes down to your platform. So our platform manages to do all of these things, as do many others, and it's not singular in our platform. So choosing your platform, one of the things that you want to do is you want to work through all of those things that we've just talked about and said, does this platform deliver all of these elements in one place? Can I actually set up my event in person? And I'm at this stage potentially, not that you should in my mind, but I'm potentially going to run an in-person event, and your customers said they want to run an in-person event. If you wanted to add a digital overlay on that, you should be able to turn everything on with a few clicks of buttons. You should be able to launch a mobile app. You should be able to launch a virtual platform. You should be able to launch a social wall. All of that should exist in your platform. And to do that, it shouldn't take more than a few minutes, because if you do it in a single platform, all of the data is residing in one place, all of those tools are residing in one place, and you can very quickly turn things on and off. Where you've got to engage with multiple providers, it gets a little bit more difficult, and that's when integration comes into play. And it's still not enormously difficult, but it comes with added costs. So the first thing I would say is you need to choose your platform. The second most important part is then about where all your data resides. So a single source of data. If you've got all the data in one place, it makes it very, very easy for that data to go in multiple directions. So in the old days, it was badging. It was, speakers' data going out to a website. It was going to an attendee app. We're now doing the same thing, but we're now compounding that. And we're pushing all of that information out to a virtual platform, out to a gamification program, or whatever it might be. But if it's all sitting in one place, there's no additional cost. You're just launching these tools, and there's no additional cost. So when people say, oh, it's going to take me a lot of time to do it in the virtual space and in the in-person space, I don't agree that that's true. You can do it very, very rapidly and not have any compounding cost. The next thing is then when you consider adding the remote attendance option, I've talked about today giving the attendees the ability to choose how they attend. So if you go to some providers, they will charge you for each of the different elements, as we've talked about, an attendee app or a virtual platform or whatever. What you should be able to do is, with a platform, you can use your platform and then you can launch each of the different attendee elements. So in our platform, as an example, we have 3 different flavors of attendee virtual portal, from a Netflix-style environment where you just flick through content, to a full 3D immersive environment where you're actually drawn into the platform, to a 2D environment which most people post-pandemic are using because it's very simple to be able to navigate. There's no instruction for your attendees and so on, so they can get in, do what they need to do very rapidly, and be part of the event and engage with the other attendees. The other part that then comes into this is then also launching your attendee app, and you should be able to do this at any point in time, and you should be able to configure these, design them, and do it all without any additional cost. So this really negates that argument to a large extent of launching virtual platforms, launching an attendee app, having my content broadcast into my attendee app. It's all too hard and it's too costly. It doesn't need to be. We then move one step further, and this is really going into the comment that was made earlier on at the start of the session about actually taking a bit of a view into the future. We're not taking a view into the future because it's here already. So one of the things that many event planners have spoken to us about is out of COVID, my AV costs are duplicating. I'm ending up with huge bills because if I want to broadcast all this content and I want all my breakout sessions to go out to all of my attendee groups, then I'm ending up with huge AV costs. Again, it doesn't need to be the case. I absolutely agree that you'll generally need, in your plenary room, you'll need a pretty substantial AV setup. You know, you'll have your designs, your sets, all of those types of things, but you're going to have that anyway. Even in an in-person event, you're going to have that. So you're not replicating anything by creating an event that actually caters to all audiences. What we've then designed in our platform, and many others are very quickly moving suit, is the ability to stand up remote technology. So what this means is that you'll have your main plenary, but then in your breakout rooms, you'll then have remote cameras, and they're very basic remote cameras set up in the back of the room. They're called PTZ or pan tilt zoom cameras, and they're set up and they're managed by software. So it means that you don't have to have an AV person in every room. You could actually have the people in your plenary room on the desk, and they're going to manage multiple rooms, which is reducing your overheads in terms of AV. It's reducing your equipment costs, it's reducing your setup costs, and all of those types of things. So in this particular environment, you'll see that we've actually built the ability to add in things like your cameras. We've then got the ability to then add in your virtual presenters. So adding another paradigm into your in-person event, when you're trying to bring your virtual presenters in, or you want to bring in virtual attendees and you want them to be on stage, you'd have a screen somewhere here that would then allow you to bring those people in. And to bring those people in, again, is all software driven. They're going to be sitting somewhere in their studio, or they're going to be sitting at home. And when we bring them in on their webcam, we're now going to have them sitting beside me here on a screen, and I could be talking to them in a conversation quite easily. And it's all controlled by the software again. We're not adding any additional cost. The software platform does this for you. We then go and connect to remote audio, and we bring all our audio back and forth, and we bring it all together in the software. And what we do is we use that technology to remotely manage this. So we then have a group of people, that your team, our team, that can manage this from anywhere in the world. And so we've got a team in Australia, for example, who manage events for our customers, and they'll actually be managing cameras, for example, in a room in Vienna, and they'll be managing 3 or 4 different rooms, taking all the shots, moving all of the audio in and out of whatever they need to be doing, moving people onto screens, and doing all of that remotely. And it's extremely simple to use. So you as an event planner, when we talk about having to create an event that's all-inclusive and deliver for multiple attendee groups, whether they be online or offline, you can do this yourself, and the additional cost is minimal. To give you an example, to do two breakout sessions and in addition to a plenary, with the equipment, you're probably looking somewhere in the realms of around £4,000, and that's reusable. So if you've got your own equipment, you can take that event to event. And the result looks a bit like this. So that equipment, which is very light footprint there, you can see that you'd have a couple of cameras, you'd have a desk, it all plugs into a laptop, it's all remotely managed, or you might have somebody on site doing it, but it gives you the ability to create an environment that you're delivering for all audiences without actually increasing any of your overheads to any particular extent. So given that we're almost out of time, the real takeaway from this is that many of the elements that we're talking about, that people are talking about having in the future, are already here. We're either just not aware of them or we're not using them. But what I would suggest is that when you start considering about planning for your events and you're working with your customers who may have a particular preference to stick to in person, I would ask them not to do that, and then I would share with them the views that it doesn't need to be expensive and it doesn't need to be difficult for you to deliver a really credible event for all audiences and to increase their reach and inclusivity. And so thank you very much for your time today. Does anybody have any questions on any of that?
Well, before we do, we should give a round of applause, please, for Paul for a very, very interesting and insightful speech. I appreciate that. We have Slido as well, but I am roving Mike if anyone has any questions in the time we've got to do those. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Hello, I've got a question about virtual exhibition booths.
Yep.
And if there's a solution out there that is actually good. Basically, I haven't found one yet.
I think that's a subjective question if they're good. Absolutely. Look, there are various different flavors of virtual exhibition booths. It's the holy grail cracking that nut. Exhibit is one of the biggest challenges through that COVID period. And I think that was probably the biggest feedback we got, that exhibitors and sponsors felt that they weren't getting the ROI. Even though you created a virtual exhibition booth, it was difficult for them to drive attendees to their stand and et cetera. I guess in our particular technology, we took a couple of different tangents on that. One was a more virtual environment, more of 3D type environment. We found that the exhibitors or the attendees tended to be drawn to the stands more when they were 3D. The 3D stands also gave the exhibitors the ability to, as they do in a real life environment, portray themselves as they would do on an exhibition floor. We also built in technology that allowed them to do on-stand presentations, so presentations like this, where they could do a one-to-many type presentation in a virtual space, and they could promote those and sell them. But the one thing I've always said to exhibitors is it doesn't matter whether you've got an exhibition in person or in virtual, it really comes down to how you market it and how you draw people to your stand. So there's no sort of utopia on that, but I would definitely say, you know, it's number one, virtual does work better. The 3D virtual does work better for exhibitions because they can have that differentiation of branding and marketing.
That's great. Thank you so much. Now, I'm conscious we're out of time, so let me just lastly plug just a few sessions that's taking place. Now, in just a second, we're going to have a play. Now, I know there's lots of work going on and it's really, really productive, but we are encouraging people to have play time. That's going to take place in about 15 minutes. There's some games that we can play in there. If you want to have a chill, it's a really nice way of breaking conferences up. It's a really nice technology, but it allows us all to chill our minds slightly. Then we go and talk about semiconductors, which sounds very much into the ether, but I assure you it's very relevant. And at the end of the day, after lunch, we've got the unmatchable Graham Smith, who's going to talk to us about the future as well. So we've got some really good stuff going on. Do come back if you're interested. But other than that, enjoy the show. And thank you so much again, Paul. Appreciate it.